I, along with Sharon Watkins, who owns Chez Zee Restaurant, and we are live streaming on Facebook. And you're at Chez Zee American Bistro. And my day job is a realtor with Sotheby's International, but I'm an avid reader and passionate about books and houses. And today our guest is Brittani Sonnenberg, who's graciously agreed to be with us. We first met Brittani this fall when Sharon and I were attending the Library Foundation Gala, which is actually where we find a lot of our guests. I stalked Bill Whitliff and Secretary last year and ended up with both of them. So Brittani was raised across 3 continents, and she has worked as a journalist in Germany, China, and Southeast Asia. And we're going to be talking about her book called Home Leave, which is her first novel. So why don't you go ahead and give us an overview of the book?
Sure. Thank you so much, Cari, and thank you so much, Sharon, for having me here. I really appreciate it. And thank all of you for being here. I've talked to a couple of you in the crowd already and have heard what avid readers you are. And all writers are equally avid readers, you know, so it's really a privilege and a joy to be with you tonight. And I also quickly wanted to say that I wanted to thank Amy Gentry for the introduction, and if you haven't read her novel, Good Is Gone, grab a copy because it will grab you and not let go till you're done reading. So yes, Home Leave is my first novel, and it's, I would say, a semi-autobiographical first novel. My mom would want me to say it's 95% fiction. So it is 95% fiction. But it sort of depicts increasingly common lifestyle, which is that of the globe-trotting family. So I grew up all over the world, which was an enormous privilege and very exciting. But as my family moved from country to country, we sort of lost a sense of home, or that home shrunk to be our family. It was sort of a new geography of 4 people. And so in this book, I was really interested in tracing that trajectory and how all the different people in a family respond to that. And I think that I spoke to one woman in the crowd who lived in the Netherlands for 11 years, and I'm sure even if you were just in San Marcos for a while and then came to Austin, you know how incredibly profoundly affecting a move is on the soul and on your identity. And so, yeah, this book is an examination of that.
And tell us what home leave means, because it's a very, I found it very almost, you know, like shore leave or leave of absence. Tell the crowd what home leave means.
Yeah, so it comes, maybe some of you know from a military term, so when people would be sent, or also with the British colonies, people would be sent to India, right, for years at a time, but then would be granted home leave, where they would go home. And the State Department kind of also had it in place to sort of remind you who you were, right? So it was a way to check in with family, but also to kind of keep your mission clear overseas, which I found very interesting. Because when you're overseas or just in a new place, there's always this kind of push and pull of, am I an outsider? Am I an insider? At what point do I blend in, and do I want to? And so I think that the notion of home leave is so complicated that this kind of optimistic idea that you could keep going back, and if you just kept going back, you'd remember and you'd stay true to those roots. And also there's just a fascinating contradiction that you've got home and leave in the same phrase, right? So it's sort of like as soon as you get home, you have to leave again. And I think that's the feeling I had as a kid when we would come back from China in the summers, and just when you relaxed into watching American TV and eating Frosted Flakes, it'd be time to go back and have shu cai bao and have Chinese people asking how big your feet were again, and to be back in that exciting adventure. But it was, it did have that feeling of sort of, I thought of also, you know, the myth of Persephone, you know, or just that kind of constant seasonal or migratory effect of being there and then being yanked or called back again.
So you wrote this book as a work of fiction, and can you tell us why you did that as opposed to writing a memoir?
Yeah, I didn't want to be disowned. And also I found, this is something, I've got a friend here, Julie, from my writing group, and we talk a lot about this question of accessing your material and what makes you curious about it. And so I'd started writing this as a memoir, and just felt like it was really wooden and kind of boring, and I felt like I was just sort of, it was like a grocery list in some ways, you know? It's just like, yeah, we lived there, we did that. But then when I allowed myself to re-enter my stories through a fictional perspective where I could sort of change things and alter the course of what actually happened, and throw in an affair for my mom. Why not? Yeah, or tell, you know, the story, the opening chapter from the point of view of a house, looking at the characters. That suddenly really illuminated for me. I don't know, it kind of gave me enough distance to see my story again.
So there are quite a few characters in this book. So we have Elise and her husband Chris, and then their daughters Leah and Sophie. And tragedy strikes, and Sophie passes away while they're in China. And as Leah becomes a young adult, she moves back to Berlin, where Jenna's son lives. And I wanted to read a little bit about what Leah, the character Leah, has to say about living in Berlin. And I'm just going to read out loud to you. Because she's dealing with, the theme is grief, you know, and so she's in Berlin and she says, this is Leah speaking, Berlin's schizophrenic structure was familiar to me. It was another kind of home life, an exhausting internal commute between life and mourning, the grief and guilt of surviving my sister were all around me in Berlin, and every sad-eyed statue, empty church, crippled Jewish graveyard, awkward silence. They weren't the same, of course, but they spoke to one another. And then I love this line. It says, a place's pain can make your own more bearable. And you lived in Berlin, and you also have a sister who passed away. This is the autobiographical part. And so I wanted to know how you felt living in Berlin and how long you lived there, and was that true for you?
It was true for me. And I think our bodies recognize home sometimes before our minds do. And so the first summer that I spent in Berlin, I just felt a resonance kind of humming in me the whole time. And you know, there are sometimes places that you go to where you really feel like you connect, maybe with the population or the art, and you're just in a really ecstatic place. And I was in a little bit of a sad place, you know, and I could feel just in, there's still bullet holes all over the place in Berlin. There's a beautiful church that was bombed that they purposely never replaced the steeple of, and so you just see wounds. And that felt to me like a relief, not to have to try and kind of be cheerful or whole or fully mended. And Germans are very down with being dour. They find you not smiling if you don't feel like smiling. They're suspicious if you smile all the time.
In fact, Elise says, and when someone asked Elise when she's living there, why are Americans always smiling when there's nothing to smile about? And is that how Germans see us, just kind of like happy, Labrador types? So tell us more about that.
Well, I never got called a Labrador, so I'm glad I didn't go that far. But I do think that, I think there's the same way maybe we have this kind of feeling like inferiority complex and Anglophilia, towards England and also maybe Europe in general. I think Germans have a complicated relationship with the United States, right? I mean, it was an occupying force after the war, but the Marshall Plan was also hugely instrumental for West Germany, and then Hollywood has been something that German kids really grow up with. And so I think, maybe, but in the same way that I think there's a lot of Americans who struggle with the American pressure to be cheerful or positive. Other cultures struggle with that too. And but it's really refreshing directness as well. And I think that I developed very close friendships in Berlin that also felt like very real, once you were in, you were really in, which is a beautiful, beautiful feeling. But I remember one time I was getting flowers at a florist, and she said, well, what kind of flowers do you want? And I was like, I don't know, just like something that came out of a field. And she said, like, this is a flower shop, not a field. And there was a lot of just that kind of smackdown.
Okay, here I have another page I want to read. So this was also, struck me just amazing. So I guess this is still Leah, the older sister who survives, who's just bereft, and she's just can hardly function. She says, you choose your friends and your boyfriends, your colleges, your curtains, your type of bread, your granola, your poison, your pants, your tattoo, your postcards at the museum shop, but you do not choose your losses. And so this book does examine the theme of grief, and that you don't get to choose those things that happen to you, and you talk a little bit about how in different countries people deal with grief differently. So kind of tell us a little more about the theme of grief and how other countries deal with grief.
I think we all know, if you've experienced the death of a loved one, that it's not a straightforward path at all. And that you go through different cycles of it. And it, is a really incredible and awful journey to take. And in some ways, the hardest thing about it when it happens with a family, I think, is that no one responds the same way. And so occasionally there are times that you can come together in your grief, but often one person's feeling terrible, another person's feeling a little better that day, and then they're bummed out that that person, when they're finally feeling a little better, that person's. And so I think, it's as individual as we are. And it's also carving a new love for the person you lost in your heart, So it's a kind of, and that takes time too, before you can feel it as love and not just as loss. And I think in terms of different countries and grief, we talked a little about Germany in some ways, which I think, with the wounds and the guilt of World War II, has been a country that very much embodies that struggle, and is often very open and in their processing of it. And then I lived also in China and Cambodia, which are places that, because of the Cultural Revolution, there's a lot of grief, but it's a place that's a fairly closed society in some ways, or I'll say that it's very different from the US culturally, and so it's hard to sort of read or map grief onto what's in front of you there. Also, it's really hard to speak good Chinese. And so, some of those conversations you can have, but they take time, and they're also dependent on a lot of trust. And actually, I found that through literature was a way in reading people like Ha-Jin to understand or to start to think about grief in China. But Cambodia, with what happened during the Khmer Rouge, when I was there, I kind of had the feeling that almost everyone I talked to had lost someone during that time. And it was a really horrible thing to see that much pain all the time, but I also felt like tears would suddenly flood people's eyes there sometimes, and that felt so familiar to me, to just be on the precipice of that. And so, yeah.
All right, well, you alluded to this, but the first chapter of this book is told from the perspective of the house where Elise, the mom, grows up. And the house is telling the story of her memories of this family. And so tell us how you came up with this concept of having the house start the book, start us off on this journey. And have houses ever spoken to you?
Well, the reason I wrote it that way is that I heard that real estate agents are big readers. That market by going straight for the housing market. No, I think it was just trying to, again, get access to something that felt very difficult to write. It's, in some ways involves a painful story that's going on in this small town, in this house in Mississippi. And I kind of had been thinking about it from all the different characters' points of view, but everyone had just such a fierce, protective feeling about their own experience that I felt like none of those were right. It needed to be sort of an outside witness. And honestly, the voice of the house just came to me when I was on the subway in Berlin one time, and it's the feeling that all writers wish they had all the time that only comes once every, 10 years or so. But it really just kind of flooded me, and I got to my friend's house and wrote as fast as I could.
Well, that voice is very strong. This voice is a very protective voice, a lot of love, a lot of grief, and that. And some terrible things happen in this house. And why did you think it was important to talk about, I guess, the sexual abuse did it help set the stage for Elise's character?
I think so. I think in some ways this book is a sort of multi-pronged attempt to break silence, that grief instills a kind of silence, and there's pressure. I mean, ultimately, it's like a wonderful, loving thing about humans, that they want other humans to be okay and not be having breakdowns all over the place. But that also means that, like, we need to sort of put up a good facade or reassure each other that everything's fine. And so I wanted to kind of break open some things that had been patched up and maybe patched up a little too hastily. And I think that that's the stuff of fiction, right? I mean, when you think of novels, and that's what's hard too, is like sometimes you don't want to write about tough stuff, but generally that's what we gravitate to watching, and it's what makes people change or transform in some way, and that's what's fascinating to watch. Or even if you're, I don't know, I think here for dinner, and this seems like a real gathering place, a place where people would have long conversations over wine and reveal things. And we all know when we've sat with a friend and they've told us something that's just like, you can see that person changing in front of your eyes, something big is shifted in them. And I think those shifts are what fiction wants to track as subtly as it can.
I thought it was very creative, and I had never read a book from the house's point of view, but it was interesting that you did feel maybe the house didn't speak to you, but that character did when you were on the subway. It was very strong, and I could certainly see that. And it was delightful. I had to, it took me, I hate to say I was slow on picking it up, but I, had to go back and say, wait a minute, her linoleum is cracking? I didn't quite get it. So I also thought the scenes and this therapist, so the family goes to see a therapist after the younger sister dies, and were extremely poignant, and also the style of writing was different. It's almost as if you were writing a screenplay. So tell us a little bit about writing that and why the tone is different.
Yeah, I think I was speaking to a writer one night in Berlin, and he was talking about how when you're writing a novel or approaching different chapters, he said he saw it as a kind of game or a puzzle to solve for yourself. And so I think I approached it in that way to some degree too. And so something that shaped the book was, okay, I'm going to set it in all these different locations, and then also I'm going to approach this different material. So this family having these therapy sessions, but how can I do it in a way that's just fun, or that's just really different, that it feels like freeing and kind of like putting on a crazy outfit and being like, what the hell, and leaving the house, And I think writing these as a play felt just kind of wild and exciting to me, and I couldn't believe that my editor let me get away with it too, because it seems like the kind of thing that they would see as indulgent and annoying. But yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure, kind of, sometimes I think everyone who does creative stuff will know this, that sometimes you just have a gut feeling, and if you go with it, it has its own internal logic. And so I think it must have some logic, but I don't know exactly what it is.
Oh, I thought it worked because it got your attention. You had a lot of different, I won't call them techniques, but you had the house, and then the way you wrote the scenes with the therapist. I thought it was fascinating, and a lot of the chapters, they switch characters who's talking, was creative. So how long did it take you to write this book?
I wrote the first chapter as a short story when I was 19 in college, and then kind of put it away. And then I started working on the memoir and did that for a couple years, and then my agent was like, no, please write a novel. And so, yeah, and the memoir was also not feeling that great, and so then it took maybe a year and a half, 2 years, so I guess 4 years, but it had just been stewing and brewing for a lot longer.
Did it feel good to get it out on a page and organized?
Yeah.
So tell us what brought you to Austin?
I have a really close friend in Berlin who spends half of her time in Berlin and half of her time in Austin in a very homely manner. And she just talked up Austin a lot, and I'd been there for 7 years, in Berlin for 7 years, and I was kind of feeling that itch again to go back home. Even though it was feeling like I was wanting to go back home into a foreign place that had taken me to Berlin in the first place. And so, yeah, I came and visited, and I felt like Austin was warm and creative and friendly, and there was country music in the coffee shops. I have a soft spot for country music. And it just, I don't know, it was just that, like, my body felt good here.
That's very interesting. And why don't you tell us what you're working on now?
Okay, so I'm working on a second novel that's set in Hong Kong. I wish there was more I could say. It's like, it's, you know, I think when you're in the beautiful swamp that is the second novel, it's just, I don't know, it's hard to describe all the alligators and swamp creatures.
All right, so stay tuned.
But I'm having fun with it.
Okay, well, good, I can tell.
Yeah.
And you speak many languages, or several languages. What all languages do you speak?
Well, I used to speak Mandarin, but I've mostly forgotten it, and I speak German.
All right, and you're also very interested in this, what is called third culture kids. It's children who've moved around a lot that don't have a sense of place. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. I know Maya in the back is TCK too. And yeah, maybe there's some in the room as well. But I mean, it's basically, right, just sort of growing up among different cultures, and specifically different countries. And so these children don't feel at home in their parents' culture, usually, or either one of their parents' cultures, if their parents are from that or not. Or they might feel some attachment and identity with it, but it's not their primary identification. What's usually said is that their primary identification is with other TCKs or other global nomads, so to speak. And yeah, it's a term that I didn't really learn about until I was in college, but I found it really helpful. There's a book that is called Third Culture Kids by Ruth E. Van Raken and David Pollack. And it's just, I don't know, any time that you kind of encounter someone thinking about something you've gone through and finding, you know, even they have something I think called like a chameleon factor, where you kind of go back and look like you fit in but feel like you don't, you know, as simple as that. That felt like really wonderful to know that other people were going through that as well.
And so that would be like military kids, refugees, you know, where the parents have a sense of home because they were, but it's the children who are affected by these multiple moves. Do I have that correct?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways it's sort of splitting hairs to kind of discuss the differences. There's sort of cross-cultural kids, that maybe would characterize immigrants and their kids and third culture kids, or maybe people who are constantly just moving every couple of years. But there's tons of overlap in those experiences, which is also, I think, the beautiful thing, that despite a lot of rupture and change, you're able to connect with so many different groups.
Yeah, Sarah Bird definitely would, she talks in her novels, or some of them, not all of them, but she moved around a lot as a military kid, and talked to her character, and over the East China Sea really had that no sense of home. So why did you move around so much?
My dad's job moved us. He works for Emerson Electric, and they just wanted him to go all over the place.
I think those are kind of my main questions, and I would be happy to turn over the mic for folks who have other questions. I tend to hog it a little too much. So. Oprah's here.
So coming home, how long have you been in Austin now?
About a year and a half.
What is it like to come home to this world politically?
Dismaying. Yeah, I mean, talking about grief, right? I think there's a lot of grief going on right now. And maybe in part it was some mourning that people were experiencing about the loss of certain jobs, and manufacturing jobs that led to that election. It was sort of layers of grief, I think, that kind of resulted in that outcome, and a kind of grieving that I feel like I and other people are doing to some extent. And yeah, I think in terms, it certainly doesn't make you feel very at home, and I think everyone has very different reactions to it, and something that I've felt ambivalent about. I think my own reaction has sort of been kind of get a little quieter, and I haven't been extremely active politically like some of my friends, and I've felt sort of bad about that, and I've also wondered about if that had to do with sort of, I don't know, growing up and just observing all the time instead of having a strong sense of allegiance or patriotism. But at any rate, I'm just sort of rambling with my thoughts, but I find it really hard. I find it really, really sad.
And your friends around the world, I assume you communicate.
Mm-hmm.
And do you find solace in their reaction, or do you find dismay, or is it supportive for you, or is it difficult? Will it be part of your next writing?
I'm setting my next book in Hong Kong, and they are having a lot of struggles with democracy there, because Hong Kong was handed back over to China in 1997, and China's sort of been cracking down on rights that it agreed under a basic law treaty with Britain, has sort of gone against that. So there have been numerous protests, and in the way that we think about fake news here, there's also a huge question about freedom of the press there, and lots of editors that have been arrested in Hong Kong. And so I've been thinking about some of those questions in parallel. But yeah, I mean, my friends who live overseas, are pretty much aghast. And so we're aghast together.
Here I'm coming.
You have a wonderful way of articulating things, and I wish I was writing down some of the way you put things, because it's beautiful. And I'm curious about your experience with writing and how you came to that.
Yeah, I think this has a lot to do with moving around all the time too. I think different kids find different outlets for that, and for me, writing was always a way of going home, and writing itself was a kind of home. And I mean, when I was a kid in elementary school, we lived in Atlanta for 5 years, and it was a very sort of solid, you know, just kind of typical American lifestyle. And I loved writing then and couldn't get enough Nancy Drew and Harry the Spy and Wrinkle in Time, and I loved writing at that time too. So I think if we hadn't moved, I would have been a writer probably as well. But yeah, I can remember in Shanghai this sort of like twist or feeling. A magic thing kind of happened when I got an assignment from my teacher to write, I think a travel article was our assignment. And when we were living in Shanghai in the early 90s, and so there weren't very many foreigners there, and so I'm 5'9" now, and I was that tall when I was 12. And then you know how it is when you're going through puberty and feeling insane, and you're feeling like everyone's looking at you anyways. And then in Shanghai, they were like staring and basically saying like, "White freak." Does not help with self-esteem stuff, or just wanting to kind of hide. But I found that when I had a notebook in my hand, I was watching, you know, and okay, they were watching too, and we were like having a stare down or something, but I wasn't concerned really with what they were thinking of me, because I was so interested in what was happening with them and everything around me. So it was this way to both see, like, I think for other writers in the room, you know this feeling when you're looking at something to write about it, it enters you in a totally different way. And so I could see it in a totally different way. And then also, I would just write pages and pages and pages about home and how much I missed it. And I think that writing from a place of longing is great fuel for writing in general. And it gives you a kind of belonging, you know, to kind of go back and forth between those feelings. Thanks for the question.
Can you tell us about finding a writers group and how it functions for you? And did you get in one, or did you create one?
Sure, yeah. So I've gone back and forth sort of between having a writers group and not, because I think there are also periods where you just want to write on your own, and that feels more safe or fulfilling at that point. But I got to a point with my writing where I was just feeling super lonely in it and in my head and kind of crazy. And so there's a great group of women writers that I had gotten in touch with, and I just sent an email to all of them and asked if any of them had writing groups or would be open to starting one, and found a writing group through that. And yeah, we meet once, like three times a month, I think, and it's been really wonderful.
There's a question up here. She could hear you, but they can't.
I'm curious, now that you're back in the States and you said you've been in Austin for 1.5 years, would you want to live overseas for a protracted amount of time again?
Right now I don't. Like, I'm really enjoying just English being all over me. And I love this feeling like a year and a half in where you start sort of going to the grocery store and being like, hey, that's the guy who's like from KUT, I recognize his voice. So, you know, like you just start to sort of piece together all the different parts of the city. And I think it really helped. I worked with the wonderful MP Mueller, who's in the room, at Tribeza magazine. And that really helped also introduce me to different facets of the city. And so I feel like I'm just in that really like curious, fun place now. And I'm going back to Berlin for the first time since I left in July. And I'm sort of nervous about like, what if I get there and I'm just like, I don't want to leave, I don't want to leave. But yeah, I could totally see myself moving overseas again, but not right now.
The reason I ask is my husband grew up overseas
Yeah.
in different places, much like you.
Yeah.
And he's been in Texas since 1979, and we're getting ready to move to Switzerland. And I feel like he has, while he's excited, I think he told me once that he felt that once he established roots here after all that, it's more difficult to pick up and go again. You know, but he's much older too, he's 56, so that's hard too. But anyway, I was just curious.
Yeah, I think it is tricky. And it's also hard, I think, sometimes to believe in your roots because they can feel ephemeral or like sometimes to me landscape has been so important. Not even necessarily, you know, people change and come and go and those connections fade even when we're living in the same cities sometimes. But, you know, that bougainvillea in Singapore or honeysuckle in Atlanta to me are just, they're companions, you know? And so I think you can also find ways, I mean, those are literal plant roots, right? But that there are other things that I think can tether you that are just as true.
Thank you.
Jim's got a question back there. Just a couple.
Britt, you're involved in some improv troops, or one improv troupe, right?
Oh.
And does that help in the writing? Does it loosen up anything? And maybe tell us a little bit about that.
Ooh, good question, Ricky. It does. I do feel like since I did improv in college, and as many of you probably know, Austin has a really thriving, incredible improv scene. I think it's the 5th biggest improv city in the country. And yeah, improv is just a really silly, often humiliating form of theater where you just have to get up and kind of hope it goes well. And writing really is like that too, but I think because improv, you're with people, you know? There's this companionship and everyone's encouraging each other, and there's so much of a philosophy there to just try it out. And if you fail, then who cares? Like the effort was what mattered. And so that's really been encouraging for me with writing too. And also something they really emphasize in improv is make the fun choice. So when you're on stage, don't try to make the smartest choice or even the funniest choice, but whatever feels like, oh, that makes my body kind of giddy to think about being a bear right now, so I'm gonna be a bear. But not because it's impressive, you know, or you're gonna make amazing bear references or something like that. So I think that's been really helpful to just think about, I mean, it's trying to remember how to be a kid, essentially, you know, and so that's good with writing, too. Yeah.
Brittany, where'd you go to college?
I went to Harvard.
Okay. I didn't.
wondering if you could read something from your book for us.
Oh, nice, Bailey. Yeah, should I?
Love it.
Okay. Maybe I'll read a little from the house's point of view. This is kind of weird house theology. From what I know of humans, their hope for God lies in their desperation for a loving witness. As a loving witness, I was always desperate for my yearnings to have physical expression. For example, Elise, as a little girl, had a favorite spot to play with her dolls behind the curtains in her parents' bedroom, as though she were sitting under a giantess's skirt. And in those moments, although Caro insists this is pure superstition, Caro's the house's best friend, another house down the block. Although Caro insists this is pure superstition, which she disparagingly refers to as my esoterics, I would filter the sun falling on Elise, make it soft and gentle, like bath water, warm but not too hot. I would keep the curtains folded loose around her frame, so no one would walk in and spy her there. I can't prove that I have these powers, of course. They assume that a door slam or a stray wind on a still day signals ghosts of old souls. They never stop to think that it's the houses themselves talking back, desperate to show their affection.
Wow.
Question here.
Yes, could you talk about, once your book is out and you move into the promotion and marketing phase, what sort of promotions and marketings are you doing? And also, can you compartmentalize that phase with the creative process that will be in your next book?
Yeah, those are great questions, and it's a difficult thing to do. I think in some ways there's a kind of natural instinct, right? Because it's the instinct that when I was a kid and I wrote a poem, made me run down to my living room and read it to my parents, and they were very loving and supportive, and so they kind of politely clapped, or did whatever. And so I think that that's there as well, and just wanting your friends to know about it, or wanting readers to be there to make this thing real. But it is kind of pernicious, because you also want it to be a career, and you're an insecure writer, and so you need tons of validation. And book sales are a terrible place to get validation. So yeah, I really struggled with it, and I think it's a good thing to learn how to handle. I'm sure, had it been like a New York Times bestseller, I would have had to learn how to handle fame, which would have been a terrible other thing to try to learn how to do. But yeah, it's a very human journey, to just confront your expectations and kind of try to give your book kind of the leg up or the help that it needs without becoming so consumed by all of those questions. So yes, but it's hard, and you have to get a little distance from it as well. But in terms of promoting, I can say that everyone should look for Julie Berwold's book coming out in fall 2017. She's back there. It's timeless. And Maya Perez from One Story is here too. So look for their stuff.
Here's a question right here.
It's a comment as much as a question. I have good friends. I just moved down here from Michigan, so I'm very resonant with your idea of moving and changing cultures. And some of my friends there, he was a lawyer with GM International and traveled, and they lived abroad for over 30 years, and their second son was actually born abroad. And they didn't feel the need to have property in the United States, until one time she was in a store and they were speaking English, and somebody walked up to her son and said, "Oh, where are you from?" And he looked up at his mother and said, "You know, the Intercontinental Hotels." I mean, that was his perception of where they were from. And Pat went home and said to her husband, "We're going to buy a place in the States." So the kids would have a perception that they were from the States.
Yeah, yeah. I'll just comment on that because I so resonate with that feeling. And we were lucky enough, my grandmother on my mom's side had a mountain house in North Georgia. And so that's where we would go every summer. And so to me, that place was really home, even though it was in a retirement community and I didn't know a soul that lived there except for Grandmartha, you know, but I knew where the best blackberry patches were, and we got there, and yeah, I think having an answer that's not a hotel is really important.
Brittany, how do parents, it's curious thinking about how parents think about their kids. I mean, did they think this was a great, wonderful experience and they were giving you all, which would be a good thing. I mean, as a parent, that's what I would make up. But did they feel at all like it was good or bad, or?
Yeah, I think in general, because they both grew up in small towns. My mom is from a small town in Mississippi and my dad is from a small town in Ohio. I think they felt ways in which they had incredible community there, and in ways in which those that kind of growing up was also very limiting. And so, yeah, I think they were ambivalent about it to some degree. Like my mom really, I remember, encouraged me to kind of stay in touch with friends, and every summer when we'd go back to Atlanta, she would say like, "Okay, are you gonna call Elizabeth Abston?" And one summer I was like, "I don't care if I ever see Elizabeth Abston again," you know, because we had rehashed those like Girl Scout stories until, you know, there was nothing left to talk about, and now it was the 7th grade. But then my parents also did great things that, like when we moved to Shanghai, I think the danger in this kind of life can be just getting in this expat bubble and becoming fearful about what's outside, or you've moved so many times that you're just kind of exhausted. And my parents would, you know, we would go on big walks through Shanghai on Sunday for hours, just exploring together. And then we also had a tradition every Sunday night to have what they called Abendbrot, which turns out to be an incorrect pronunciation of the German word Abendbrot, which is just the German way to have like cold cuts for dinner, but it was something they had picked up from living in Germany, that they made a family tradition for us. And we had, like, our speech was very peppered with, like, you know, my mom's Mississippi stuff and German and some Chinese and some Singlish. And so I think I've also encountered families, you know, where I think something that's so important to think about, especially in this day and age, as things become increasingly globalized, is prejudice that's conscious, you know, or unconscious, but mostly unconscious. And so how are you mirroring your attitude or your fear or even your sadness about not being in Topeka anymore, you know, and how you're responding to the local population, and that I think is super influential in what your kids pick up and how they're going to take in that experience. So I was really lucky to have parents who were very open and encouraging of that.
Where are your parents now?
They're in Minneapolis.
That's a wonderful, interesting city, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah.
Great for the arts, yeah.
Okay, who else? Well, home, that's such a such a compelling topic.